Are you back here with me? I almost got lost myself there for a moment. Have you heard the story of the three princes of Serendip? Yeah, that's real. I'm not kidding. It's a story 1,000 years old, an old Persian story. The story goes like this. A king had 3 sons, and he loved those sons. And he wanted the very, very best for them, as every parent wants for their children. Well, he had a lot of resources, so he found the absolute best tutors that were available. And he employed them to teach his sons so that they could have a wealth of education, of information, in order to navigate the world ahead of them. Well, the sons learned well and came to manhood still studying, and the king called them in one day, each of them individually, and he proposed this to them. He said, I'm getting along in years, and I'm about at a place where I'd really like to be able to spend my life in contemplation, the rest of it. So what I would like you to do is I would like you to accept the rule of this kingdom. You've studied, you've done well. I give to you the kingdom as I retire into contemplation for the rest of my life. And each of the 3 sons had the same response. And it was, oh no, Father, you are extremely wise. Your people need you. And I do not feel up to the task to be able to take over the rule of this kingdom. The king was a little taken back, but he was also very honored in that his sons respected him and saw the value of how he had ruled the kingdom. But publicly, he took another tack. He banished his sons from the kingdom, sent them out to the wide world on their own, and that would seem to be an end that was very disagreeable, very dislikable. But the 3 sons went into the wide world full of all of the knowledge and training and excitement about life that they had, and they fared well. They had many very interesting experiences. And one in particular is brought down to us through the fables of history. And it was this. They one day were journeying together and met a merchant who was distraught. He was just distressed to such a degree that they decided to tell him a story out of their experience, perhaps to calm him. And they told him the story of how they had followed a camel that they had never seen. And they described to him the camel. They said, well, the camel is blind in one eye. The camel is lame. The camel has a missing tooth. The camel was carrying butter on one side and honey on the other side. And riding the camel was a pregnant woman. Well, they thought that this might cheer the merchant up, but it enraged the merchant because the merchant had lost just such a camel. And he suspected that these 3 young men had stolen his camel. So he forced them to, in this new kingdom where they were, to the court of the emperor, accusing them and wanting to get justice for himself at his camel having been stolen. And the emperor questioned the young men and said, how is it? You say you have never seen the camel? How is it that you can describe this camel in such detail without having seen the camel? Well, the young man went on to say, well, we noticed as we followed the path that there was really green grass on one side of the path and not so green grass on the other side of the path. And the camel ate the grass that was less green. So we understood that the camel did not see well and was blind in one eye. We saw little wads of grass, just tooth-sized, and we knew that the camel was missing a tooth and that the little wads of grass had escaped. We saw ants on one side, and we knew that the ants had been drawn to butter. And we saw flies on the other side and knew that they had been drawn to the honey. We saw that as the camel proceeded, 3 footprints were very clear and one evidenced some dragging. So we knew that the camel was lame. Then we saw where the camel had stopped and knelt down, and a small footprint was in the ground alongside. And as we looked further, we saw that there were also handprints. And it was very apparent to us that a pregnant woman had stopped to relieve herself, and unable to just stand, she had taken her hands to push herself up so she could remount the camel. Well, it was quite a story, and just as the story was finished, a messenger came in and said, a lost camel has been found, and we don't know the owner. Well, of course, it was the lost camel of the merchant. And all were amazed at the sagacity and the ability to observe that the young man had evidenced. They, of course, became trusted top advisors to the emperor, and they were enriched, and it all came out to their great, great benefit. So for these young princes, what had brought them to this place was a collection of surprising, even unsought events that in the end brought them great benefit. Serendipity, we now would call it, and a word that did not appear until 700 years after that fable was started. And now we get to know it, and I'd like to give you just a bit of my definition for serendipity, and that's finding something valuable or something beneficial. The things that you don't seem to be looking for, suddenly these valuable things come together, present you with something very beneficial when you don't necessarily even seem to be looking for that. I think there's a spiritual lesson in this story and in the idea of serendipity, very much associated with play, as we're talking about, because it's very lighthearted in a way. So I decided to take a little bit of an inventory about some of the spiritual truths that I think apply. And one of them is one that we speak of often, and that is the omnibeneficence, or the all-goodness of the divine, and the all-goodness of our very nature as expressions of the divine. It was and is the divine intention for good always, in every situation. I also remembered that phrase from the Christian scriptures, all things work together for good. Appearances sometimes don't seem to indicate that good is forthcoming, but all things do work together for good. And some of us who have lived years, probably all of you, have seen how appearances that at first looked bad to us ended up being for our benefit. And then I think of the other truth that what we see, what we focus on, determines what we get. So if we, in fact, see the good, if we, in faith, see that which is to our benefit, see that which is good for all, in fact, that does come into manifestation. So goodness is one of those things that I inventoried. But another one that we don't speak very much about is purity of heart. I always have trouble with that purity word. It seems like it's was too closely associated with the idea of being a Puritan, and that wasn't so likable for me. But purity of heart is, for me, as I look at it again, experiencing the divine, experiencing divine good. In the Sermon on the Mount in Christian scriptures, the part of it that we call the Beatitudes, one of those Beatitudes is, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Well, I'd like to extend that just a little bit. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall experience the divine as it was designed to be. They shall see God. So I think that purity of heart means consciously living that divine expression that we are. And I also think that it means focusing, giving our attention to the calling that is uniquely ours. Each of us has a unique place in this world, a unique place in our families, and each place in unique place in our communities. And as we focus on that God-given unique calling, we are acting from a purity of heart. The other truth that I thought applied very well comes from the Persian poet Rumi. What you seek is seeking you. We know that as expressed in a couple of universal laws, the law of cause and effect, for example. What you're putting out here has an effect over here, and the two correspond. Or the law of attraction. The frequency that you're on matches the frequency of that which you desire, and you are drawn together. So I like to think that that is true of the desires of the heart, and that those desires of the heart prefigure what's going to come into manifestation in your life. Desires are not always intentions made with words, although sometimes they are, and that's very powerful. But sometimes they're almost a hidden desire, hidden even to yourself, so that when they come into manifestation, they're surprising, they're amazing, they're light, they're playful. So I think that, at least for me, I'm not always in touch with those real desires. But the big thing about those desires is that when we're able to detach them from a specific expectation, a connection with, and a determination that it's going to happen a certain way, we're able to be open to the surprise, to the beneficial elements that come together to bring our heart's desire into our lives. That's the inventory of spiritual truth that I saw. But as I thought about this, I also thought about, and I'll run through this quickly, another story that you may or may not be familiar with, but I bet you are. The story had these elements: a captive, an orphan, a rebellious wife, a disgruntled ruler, two would-be assassins, one honorable man in the right place at the right time, a scheming politician, a tall gallows, and a longing for justice. Wow, that's a lot of elements that certainly would make for a story, and it did, because the story is that of a young girl, Esther, who's had lost her parents. When she lost her parents in Judah, a country that time was besieged by the Babylonians, she was bereft, except that a cousin, quite a bit older and very kindly toward her, adopted her. That cousin was Mordecai. The two then were later taken captive by the Babylonians and transported to Babylon, where they and a great number of other Jewish captives were dispersed throughout the land. So happened that King Ahasuerus did not very much tolerate anything other than absolute obeisance to his command. And on one occasion, he threw a great banquet, and his queen declined to appear to show how beautiful she was to all of the people. Well, she risked her life in doing that. Ahasuerus did not dispatch her, but he in fact determined that he would put her away and seek another queen. And so he looked at all of the beauties in the land to find a queen among them. Interesting that Esther should be there in this mix of young women, but she was. And when she was gathered with the others to be considered by the king, she was found to really catch the eye of the king's chief eunuch. And so he groomed her very closely and very well as she prepared to meet the king. And in fact, she did, and he fell in love with her, and she was designated to be his queen, and did become his queen. At the same time, Mordecai was wondering what would happen to his adopted daughter, Esther, and he tried to stay very close. So he positioned himself near the palace. And in doing so, interestingly enough, he happened to overhear a conversation of two assassins, or would-be assassins, that were going to assassinate the king. He was able to relay that to the king, and the king was able to escape that attempt, and the assassins were apprehended and put to death. That all was going well, and Esther was in the grooming process. The problem with Mordecai was that the king's chief advisor, Haman, he didn't have a respect for this individual. He didn't bow to him as should be done. Haman didn't like that at all, didn't feel like he could personally issue a vendetta, but he gave out a proclamation, proposal to the king that all of the Jews that were in the kingdom could be exterminated because of supposed threats to the kingdom. Because the advisor was trusted, Haman, his wish was granted, his proposal was approved, and he now went on to vindicate himself from this Mordecai, who would not pay him any respect, and he built a huge gallows to hang Mordecai. At the same time, interestingly enough, serendipitously we might say, the king had a sleepless night. And in having a sleepless night, he pored over the records of the palace and found that Mordecai had been the one who had helped him to escape the assassination attempt. In doing so, he had not been honored in any way. And the king suddenly knew that he must honor this Mordecai. So when Haman the advisor arrived at the palace the next morning, ready to get in motion the execution of Mordecai, the king's first question to Haman was, what would you say should be done for the person that the king wants to honor? Of course, Haman was thinking that must be he himself. And so he suggested that expensive robes be placed on this person, that the king's horse be employed, and he be led through the city, and it was proclaimed that this is the person that the king wanted to honor. So the king said, well, good. Mordecai, that guy, he's the one that I want to honor. Go take him and put him on the horse, give him the robes, and lead him through the land and proclaim that he is the one the king wants to honor. Well, it all came to a screeching halt for Haman, because Esther was able to go into the king without being invited, again, risking her life, and to say that this proclamation that the Jews could be exterminated was wrong, and that Haman was the one who was behind the whole thing. Haman ended up begging her for her for relief from what he had done, but he did not get that. Interesting story, because in the end, justice was there in a different way than was expected, even by Esther. A great number of disparate events and situations and people who came together for a very surprising and beneficial outcome, one of justice, one that nobody could have expected. I love to think that this is an evidence of serendipity in a very dramatic kind of way for this. So how can we put ourselves in the place, not maybe to replay the story of Esther or the three princes of Serendip, but to put ourselves in a place where we can benefit from the surprising elements that come into our life to come together to benefit us? And I'd like to suggest that there's just a couple of ways we can do that. For me, it's plumbing my heart's desire. Sometimes I don't know what I really desire. And sometimes I need to plumb my heart's desires to know them. Then I can affirm them. Then I can focus on them. And that will help to bring things together via something like the law of attraction. But I also think that it's important for me to live as closely as I can by my divine nature. The Christ within, we spoke of, living that consciously out into the world. And sometimes I must admit, I just kind of let that go and just coast. So being able to consciously live that out, my divine nature into the world, is an important part for me. The third thing I think is to broaden the realm of possibility. So often, children can imagine all sorts of things and they have a blast with it. But sometimes I am so focused, so narrow visioned, that I don't broaden the scope of possibility. I'm not surprisable. I'm not spontaneous, and I have choice with regard to these things. So I like to think that play, and by the way, yesterday in the Daily Word, the word was playful. And I liked the very last part of that daily word. It said, my playful nature blesses me at every level of my being. I would like to think that that serendipity is a great blessing for us. And in fact, we are designed for serendipity, and so it is. Amen.